Hello to everyone. We are learning we're learning Tanya, chapter 37. We're going to discuss the superiority of Torah study today. And we can find it in the Chayenu, page 90. In today's lesson, despite the superiority of action mitzvahs, explained previously, we discussed the greatness of action mitzvahs. Torah study nonetheless unique. There's uniqueness to Torah study. Number one, it involves and affects the higher inner faculties of the soul. Number two, it stems from God's mind, employing the metaphor of the human form as analogies to God rather than his limbs. So meaning you're connecting with God on a higher level. So there's two things why Torah is unique. Number one, it takes from you a higher level, involves and affects the higher inner faculties of the soul, for you to be studying Torah, to understand what you're learning. And number two, it stems from God's mind, meaning the Torah is the Torah of the wisdom of God. So we see at any rate that charity is superior to all other mitzvahs, as we learned yesterday, including Torah study, meaning it's a greater mitzvah. But here, one may object. So we're going to see today the uniqueness of Torah study. We said in davening every day that Talmud Torah, the learning of Torah, correspond to them all. I knew why is it? Learning Torah is in speech and in thought. Meaning that the inner garments of your vital soul. In order to learn Torah, you got to use inner garments. You can't just use your hands. You have to concentrate, you have to listen, you have to absorb, and you have to review it. And it takes effort to understand Torah study and to ultimately apply it. So Talmud Torah b'dibu machshava, what it has to is using the inner garments of thought and speech. And these are called the levushim apnimim, the inner garments of the vital soul. You're also using your intellectual faculties, which is wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, that all are coming from where? They're all coming from Klippas Neiga, which we learned that's a neutral power that can be used either way. This type of concealment can be utilized either for the good or for the bad. That are all in the vital soul. Now, at the time of learning, everything is being included in sanctity, in kedusha, in holiness, in purity. So in the time of learning Torah, meaning the moment that your mind is occupied with Torah study, the mind cannot be occupied with too many things in one shot. If you, at that moment, let's say you concentrated, that's the one thing that you have on your mind, you elevated your vital soul as well, and all its garments. When you're learning Torah with concentration and intelligence. Now, the intellectual faculties applies to Torah study are absorbed in the holiness of the mitzvah of Torah study, and thereby ascend from the realm of Klippas Neiga, from a state of being neutral and having a potential to be used for bad. They previously belonged, being a part of the vital soul, to the realm of holiness, of kedusha, of sanctity. Although it was explained in chapter 12 that the Beinoni is capable, meaning the intermediate person is capable of transforming to holiness only the garments of the animal soul, and not the soul faculties themselves, meaning he's able to tap in, to touch only the outer garments, not the inner. There is no contradiction here. The latter statement applies only to the midos, to the emotional faculty, to the emotional attributes of the animal soul. The Beinoni is indeed incapable, the intermediate person is incapable of transforming the midos to holiness. Chabad, however, meaning the emotive attribute, is unable to convert them to holiness or transform them. But Chabad, meaning his wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, his intellectual faculties can be transformed even by the Beinoni. So his emotive attributes are more challenging for him to change. He can dominate them, he can control them, he can make sure he can decide how he wants to respond, how he wants to express himself. If he wants to express himself gently, he wants to express himself assertively, he wants to express himself in a vulgar way, in an intelligent way, in a nice way, he can control it. But the urge to do it in this way or that way, it's not in his control. Meaning his emotions are locked, are set. So the Beinoni is unable to do that, but he's capable of working with his Chabad, with his wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. However, his Chabad can be transformed even by the Beinoni. Even an intermediate person has that capability of transforming his intellectual faculties. The Alter Rebbe now explains the difference between emotive attributes and intellectual faculties. It says, although Beinonim are incapable of mastering the substance and the essence of the attributes, Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes, and so on, so as to transform them into holiness. Even we see it with the patriarchs. Avram was Chesed, and primarily he did Chesed. Obviously, he had times that he did Gevurah, but primarily Avram was Chesed. He didn't change himself and says, okay, since I was given the power of Chesed, of kindness, from now on I'm doing the opposite. I'm going to do severity. No, he served Hashem with Chesed, with kindness. And Yitzchak, which was severity and sternness and being stringent, being strict, and he didn't change himself to be Chesed. He obviously was capable of doing Chesed as well, but that was not his main theme. So we see that the Ma'usan v'atzmusan shamidim, meaning the very essence of the emotive attributes, do not change. Lo yochol haben le'avchon l'kedusha. Obviously, with Avraham Avinu, they're not in the level of Beinoni. They're all great tzaddikim, the patriarchs, but they are capable of transforming them if they wanted to, but they didn't really need to. If they needed to use Gevurah, they use Gevurah. They need to use severity, they use severity. They need to use kindness, they use kindness. But the main thing was Avraham Chesed, Yitzchak Gevurah. Ainu mishum shara. Why is it? Why can't we change the essence of the emotive attributes? Mishum shara chazak yesod midos b'chochma bin avdas. The evil that dominates, or the evil that reside in the emotive attributes, is stronger than the evil that is in the intellectual faculties. You have two kinds of you have evil penetrating every aspect, and the evil that penetrates the emotive attributes is much stronger than the evil that penetrating the intellectual faculties, and that's why it's harder to transform. And why is it that the evil that penetrated the intellectual faculties are smaller, are softer? It's because there's more light in the intellectual faculties. They're nurturing from sanctity. They are closer to sanctity. They're nurturing more from sanctity, and there's less room for evil. There's less room for an opposition. So that's why it's easier to work with the evil, to transform the evil of the intellectual faculties, and much harder to transform the evil of the emotional faculties. Now, don't get me wrong, you can still control it at any given time. But just to change who you are, what type of makeup you have, what is your psyche, what is your inner inclination, that's something that is that you're born with and you will die with. The same. Hopefully, Mashiach will come. Nobody will die, but that's what you have. You have what you got, so to speak. The shattering of the vessels, and obviously, it's not a bad thing. We have to understand that this is really tools that we're given by God to fulfill the individual mission that we have. So if Chesed is dominating by you, You have to obviously use it in a proper way, but this is your mission. This is what you have to utilize. This is the toolbox that you received, and you have to use that toolbox. And for someone else that has more gevurah, more severity, that's the toolbox that he received from Hashem. And he needs to use what he has. He has to temper it, he has to work on it to make it more refined, make it gentle, to make it soft. But nevertheless, this is the toolbox that he has. The shattering of the vessels, which gave rise to the existence of Klippa, that's really the source of Klippa, the concept of having strong lights, big givers, and there's no vessels to contain the flow, the light. So it creates a shattering of the vessels, occurred primarily in the middle. So meaning the shattering of the vessels happens, where do you have, we have this concept, Shviras HaKelim. Shviras HaKelim is anyone that cannot handle an opposition. That could be Shviras HaKelim even now time. It's not just in the world of chaos that there was Shviras HaKelim. Shviras HaKelim can happen, breakage of vessels can happen at any given time to anyone. If you're so stuck in your ways that you are not capable of hearing someone else or listening to another view, maybe someone thinks differently than you, but to you it's so clear that you say, how can someone else think differently? There's no way that someone that could create by you Shviras HaKelim, breakage of the vessels. And where is it happening? Primarily in the emotions. If your emotions are strong, your Shviras HaKelim, your breakage of the vessels will be even stronger. The shattering of the vessels which gave rise to the existence of Klippa occurred primarily in the emotive attributes. And it is therefore more difficult to elevate the evil of the emotive attributes. The evil of Chabad, however, the evil of the intellectual faculties, can be transformed to good through intensive Torah study. Intensive Torah study transforms the intellectual faculties. We have two reasons for the superiority of the mitzvah of Torah study. Number one, it is practiced with the innermost soul garment. To learn Torah, you're practicing it with your wisdom. The innermost soul garment, thought. And number two, it transforms the actual soul faculties of Chabad to holiness. Now, these are the two unique superiority the Torah study has. So again, number one, you practicing with the innermost, using your really essence, your intelligence, your wisdom, your thought. And number two, you're transforming the Chabad, you're transforming the wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. Aside from this, there is another far more important aspect of the superiority of Torah study over all the other mitzvahs. This was already mentioned in Tikkun Zohar, the writings of Kabbalah, the Ramach Pikud, the Ramach Chavon, the Malko. It's written the 248 commandments, mitzvahs, are connected with 248 channels, 248 limbs of the kings, channels of flow. Concerning Torah, however, it is written in Tikkun Zohar, Torah and the Holy One, meaning the Torah and God, blessed be, are entirely one. Unlike mitzvahs, which are merely limbs, the Alter Rebbe now elucidates the difference. And we're looking at ourselves, our body, and we can see the distinction between the life that goes to the head and the life that goes to the finger or to the hand. There's no comparison between the vitality of the 248 limbs to the vitality of the brain, of the moichin. What is the moichin? What is the brain? The brain really in charge of the three faculties that we mentioned, the three intellectual faculties: wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. Similarly, now, so too by way of analogy, allowing for the qualification that any comparison between human and divine traits must be distant. However, by myriads of degrees, meaning it's not really a good example, but that's what we have. It is with regard to the illumination of the Ein Sof light closed in mitzvahs of action, compared to the illumination of the Ein Sof light closed in the Chabad, in the intellectual faculties of one immersed in the wisdom of the Torah, an illumination commensurate with the level of each man's intellect and his grasp of Torah. Obviously, each one is capable of understanding to a different level, different degree of understanding, of grasping, to the extent that his intellect grasps the Torah which he studies. It is united with godliness, with a unity comparable to that of one's intellect with his soul. Herein then lies the superiority of Torah study over other mitzvahs. Even over charity, Torah study affects a much higher level of unity with godliness than do the mitzvahs of action. So again, Torah study affects a much higher level of unity with godliness than do the mitzvahs of action. Although one grasps the Torah only as it is closed in physical terms, the law concerning two men who fighting over a garment or arguing over a garment, one who trades a cow for a donkey, how then can it be said that through study of such laws, learning who is right, who is wrong, a guy that's asking to buy a cow and the seller is sending him a donkey, or vice versa, one attains these lofty levels of unity with godliness? What's the connection between a proper social conduct between two people that you're telling me that now by understanding this law of why the Torah says that Reuven is, for example, is going to be right and Shimon is wrong, or vice versa, how is it creating unity with godliness? What does it have to do with godliness? So yet, the Torah has been likened to water. That water is descending from a high place to a low place. The water on the lower level is exactly the same water in the higher level. They just came from the clouds, they came from above, but they're still the same water, although they are now in the ground. So similarly, the laws of Torah, although they have descended, meaning why? What does it mean the laws have descended? Because they're now dealing with, seemingly they're dealing with the ordinary things. Deal with ordinary physical situation, still consist of God's will and wisdom. Even though we might not see it, okay, it's two people are fighting, you said this one will get half, this one will get half, or whatever the solution would be, or whatever the sentence would be. In studying Torah, one is united with God's will and wisdom, and thereby with God Himself. If you can't tap into God's will and wisdom, you are tapping into God Himself. Studying Torah, so the takeaway from today's Tanya is studying Torah is extremely impactful, creates tremendous impact. It changes your inner consciousness, your mind and speech, not just your action, which is external to you. Become a Torah mind and Torah speech. So we see the great effect on Torah study. I always like to quote my grandfather of blessed memory, Rabbi Yaakov, he always used to tell me the pasuk in Mishlei, in King Solomon, said, "Salsalea u'toimeko," that if you tap into the Torah will uplift you, will raise you up. And we see the same thing over here with the Alter Rebbe is telling us that it changes your inner consciousness, your mind and speech, not just your action. So let's all become a Torah mind and a Torah speech, and that's for sure will hasten the coming of Mashiach. Buchim Tiyu. We'll continue with another 2 short videos.